So Labour managed to hang on to Stoke but fell to the Tories in Copeland in Cumbria, an area which has been a Labour heartland for decades. Meanwhile, in Scotland, support for Labour is at an all-time low. So what is their future in Scotland and what should they be doing to make themselves more electable? I'm joined now by Dr. Gerry Hassan, the political writer and author of The Strange Death of Labour Scotland, and Lesley Brennan, who's a Labour councillor in Dundee and who's recently been elected to the executive of the Scottish Labour Party. Well, first of all, Lesley Brennan, your reaction to the remarks that Sadiq Khan has made this morning in the Record newspaper?
Sorry, I haven't actually seen the comments.
Let me read you what he says. He says, "There's no difference between those who try to divide us on the basis of whether we're English or Scottish and those who try to divide us on the basis of our background, race or religion." And on the front page of the Herald, the headline that is, "Scottish nationalism is the same as racism."
I would say that the points I would agree with Sadiq is about people dividing due to nationalism. Us in the Labour Party are focused on actually building people across in political education to actually recognise the class structures, and that's why we offer a way forward through a socialist, a social democratic view with the new federalism. Because it's about recognising our similarities rather than actually people who I represent in Lunlathen and Dundee, a very deprived area. Their lived experience is very similar to the people who live in Liverpool in poverty. And that's why solutions need to be made about the political and economic problems rather than actually sticking up a border.
Well, Gerry Hassan, do you think what Sadiq Khan said, I mean, you could interpret it in that way as a perfectly legitimate point that Labour stands for the unity of working people across the UK, it's not a nationalist party, or is it another example of Labour being somewhat cloth-eared when it comes to Scotland?
It's pretty bad, and given, we're not that far from when Sadiq Khan had to face the disgraceful campaign, racist campaign that Zach Goldsmith ran for London Mayor, it is true to say that in the Sadiq Khan article, the title, The Daily Record, of giving it Scottish nationalism is the same as racism. Those words do not appear in the piece, so that's a kind of the Record editorialising, but it's a pretty grim piece. And what it gets down to is that the SNP have been about Scottish politics for a long time, for most of our adult life, and despite that, the Scottish Labour Party have never got round to normalising the SNP to understand how to deal with them. So we have this kind of pathetic attempt, as we see with Sadiq Khan, and a lot of rhetoric at Scottish Labour Conference that is just kind of all over the place on the SNP. You have to understand your political opponents and deal with them in a way Scottish people recognise them. There's lots of faults in the SNP. You can pull the SNP government up for all sorts of things, but Scottish people generally regard the SNP as part of the mainstream of Scotland, not as some Trump-like populists.
Well, that's the point. I mean, even taking on board the point that Gerry Hassan has reinforced, Lesley Brennan, that Sadiq Khan doesn't quite say what the headline appears to make him say. To most people in Scotland, the idea that the likes of John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon can be compared to racism will be at best ludicrous and at worst deeply insulting.
I think the Scottish Labour Party rejects nationalism. We want to ensure that the problems that lie in the economy are the structural imbalances of power and the economic
power.
Sure,
but it's one thing to say you reject nationalism, and as I say, there is a way of interpreting Sadiq Khan's remarks in that way. But the point is, it looks deeply insensitive. The point Gerry Hassan is making is that Labour has yet to find a way of talking about the SNP and talking to people who voted SNP over the last few years that doesn't just put them off, that actually brings them in.
It's about talking to people about the problems that they face in their daily lives and recognising that actually the problems that they face will not be solved by separating away from the rest of the UK. It is the structural issues. I did an event on Tuesday with Jim Sillars, and Jim Sillars was saying about one of the challenges that we face in Scotland is the lack of political education, the lack of understanding of the political environment and the economic environment.
How interesting you say that, because of course Jim Sillars is a Scottish nationalist, so is he the same as divisions caused by racism and religion?
It is about understanding.
No, but is Jim Sillars in that same camp that Sadiq Khan is branding the SNP? He's a nationalist.
Jim Sillars is a nationalist. He wants to recalibrate the power and the economic system. The difference between myself and Jim Sillars is that he wants to separate from the rest of the UK. I want to recalibrate it so to make sure the power is distributed within the UK and with a federal system.
So
and that's what the Scottish Labour Party wants.
By the Sadiq Khan logic, there's no difference between Jim Sillars and those who try to divide us on the basis of whether we're English or Scottish?
I've said Jim Sillars has an approach to the recalibration of power and economic power and capital, which actually wants Scotland to be separate from the UK, whereas I say the offer is socialism.
Right, OK. I think Jim Sillars would say the offer was socialism as well, but let's leave that. And this new idea of a federal UK, it would be a little bit more convincing, wouldn't it, if A, there was any remote prospect of Labour coming to power in the UK to implement this, and B, if anyone in England was remotely interested in federalism?
It's about the fact of, as I keep saying, it's not a difficult answer. It's about political education, understanding where the problems are and addressing it. There's a hunger, not just in the UK, for change. We see it across Europe, we see it in America. How do we actually recalibrate the system so it's fair for working people?
Sorry, where is the hunger in England for a federal UK?
The hunger in the rest of the UK is for a fairer system, and that is actually one of the things about the Brexit vote. People were wanting to make sure that actually they felt the system wasn't fair, it wasn't working for them, and this was their signal.
Yes, but what you're saying is completely irrelevant to the question I asked you, which is where is the hunger in... It only makes sense for Labour to advocate a federal UK if in England there is demand for a federal UK. You may well be right that people in England feel they've been unfairly treated, but they are not demanding a federal England.
I think people want change. The change that we are offering in the Labour Party is for a federal system. And that is where we need to be. Because actually that's how you redistribute power and wealth.
OK, all right. Gerry Hassan, is this a runner? I mean, at least it gets Labour back in the race, doesn't it, in terms of having something to say about Scottish nationalism? Well,
it says something, but there's a whole host of problems in this. One is, I mean, when Lesley was talking about hunger, clearly there is a hunger about the state of the United Kingdom, the state of the planet, basically, but there is clearly no innate demand anywhere for federalism in Scotland or the United Kingdom. And the bigger problem that we kind of alluded to is one is the Labour leadership, whatever Tom Watson says today, the Labour leadership have shown no interest in federalism. But the second bigger point is that Scotland's a nation of 5 million people, cannot continually constitutionally reinvent the United Kingdom. The English people have to have a say in that. And English political classes, English public opinion, has shown no interest in federalism. Plus, the fact is, there is no federal Labour plan at the moment. It's a kind of mood music. Now, mood music might matter in certain points, but it's a bit late just to try and bring that kind of...
Well, another obvious point in this, Lesley Brennan, is Kezia Dugdale said yesterday that she wouldn't mind seeing a question about federalism on the ballot if there was another independence referendum. But how can Labour argue for that? I mean, it's surely not up to voters in Scotland to vote for a federal UK. It's up for people in the UK to vote for that.
The Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, is setting out an agenda for a People's Convention to talk about how the redistribution of power. John Trickett has written about a federal approach to the UK. Because we recognise that's the way to go.
You're just ignoring the question I asked you. My question was this. How could you, on a ballot paper in a Scotland-only referendum, have a question about whether England and the rest of the nations of the UK should become part of a federal system? It's not up to people in Scotland to decide what people in the rest of the UK should or shouldn't do.
I think with a Labour government in 2020, we would see an approach to rebalancing the UK. And it is about the whole of the UK, and actually recognising that that's where their future lies.
Gerry Hassan, third. I mean, there was talk about another question on the referendum, but surely it's not up to us here to say there should be a federal UK. I mean, yes, as Lesley says, there could be a constitutional convention.
Yeah.
It could be Labour policy. They could win an election and implement it.
Yeah.
But that's not what Kezia Dugdale was saying. She said she would like a question on a referendum which might happen within a year or 18 months.
I know. I mean, basically, since we've had the first Indie ref, the Scottish Labour Party have been all over the place about how Labour would act in a second independence referendum and so on. And yesterday's position just seems another kite being floated when this is not a time for kite flying and mood music.
Well, except it does enable them to say that now their policy is they're against independence. That's been ambiguous for over a year.
The fact that you just said what you said, that Scottish Labour's policy on independence has been ambiguous, tells you that the deep hole they are in. If there's one thing the Scottish Labour Party should be consistent on, it's the fact they're meant to be against independence. Also, they say they're not a unionist party, and yet they have ended up in a position that looks rather like a kind of last-ditch unionist party. The Labour Party need a consistent position on not just independence. They don't need to talk about federalism, because that's talking about the constitution. People need to know where they stand, and people don't know where Scottish Labour stands. And that isn't about a lack of political education. That's the fault of the Scottish Labour Party.
Right. Just time, Lesley Brennan, for you to tell us how confident you are that Jeremy Corbyn will win the next general election.
I am very confident. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, their approach in actually going around the country. Actually, John McDonnell's has an economic conference in Glasgow in a few weeks.
OK, but basically you think Jeremy Corbyn's a winner?
Yes, definitely. I think their approach is actually what people want to actually resolve the issues, the structural issues in the country.
All right. Gerry Hassan, Lesley Brennan, thank you both very much indeed.